Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 of Unit 5. Unit 5, we're going to take a look at imperialism, the United States' attempt to expand beyond the contiguous 48 states, and kind of an extension of manifest destiny, and how throughout this era the United States would rise and become one of the most powerful nations in the world. Specifically today, we're going to take a look at what exactly imperialism is, also proponents of imperialism, why they thought it was necessary for the United States to expand, reasons for expansion, and also take a look at some of the territories that the United States acquired during this era of imperialism, which lasted from really after the Civil War in the late 1860s through the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s. So imperialism, the definition is when stronger nations attempt to create empires by taking control of weaker nations. This doesn't always have to be done militarily. It can be done through the use of the economy, like was done in many Latin American countries, or politically, and sometimes the military is used. But it was like the United States was in a big game of risk during this time with Germany, who was its biggest competitor, Russia, France, Great Britain, Spain was in a decline. But these countries were trying to establish empires where they could get raw materials if necessary, and maybe even more importantly, sell goods that were being created. Just more territory, and like I said earlier, an extension of manifest destiny, where the United States was in this continual process of expansion.
World domination. Speak boy, carry a big stick. World domination.
Next, we need to take a look at why the United States felt it necessary to expand. Remember, manifest destiny in the United States had believed it was their fate to control all the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Well, that had occurred, and now they needed to look elsewhere. One reason was their desire to compete with the European powers, which mainly were Germany, Great Britain, France, and like I said earlier, Spain was spiraling downward. Many in the United States believed, again along the lines of manifest destiny, that the United States was a chosen people and our system of government and our belief system was better than others, and so it was our responsibility to spread our ideas and values upon other people in the world. There was a famous poem that came out called The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, in which he described this as a burden of the white man to help the backward people of lesser developed countries maybe see the light and follow the path that the United States was setting. And finally, on this slide, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was established way back in 1820, and it was new foreign policy which stated that the United States expected European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere and the United States would not interfere in the Eastern Hemisphere. Well, the United States was never really powerful enough to enforce the Monroe Doctrine for many years. But this would become important following industrialization, when the United States was gaining in power, and eventually it would lead the United States into war, the Spanish-American War, which would happen right at the end of the 19th century. There was also some concern about the growing population of the United States, that eventually the United States was going to become overpopulated. they would run out of raw materials, natural resources, and so this was also justification for expansion and imperialism. They needed to find new areas that could supply the United States with natural resources, and probably even more importantly, and maybe most importantly of all of these reasons, was through industrialization, the United States was producing goods and crops far quicker than it ever had. And they were producing these things in numbers that were maybe too great for consumption in the United States. So they needed to look elsewhere to establish markets to start selling the goods that were being produced in the United States. Some proponents of U.S. expansion, Alfred Mahan, he believed that it was absolutely crucial for the United States to develop a stronger Navy. The United States' Navy was never very powerful because it had never needed a powerful Navy. Most of all the conflicts that the United States had been involved in were pretty much centered right around the North American continent. But if you looked at the history of the world and all of the most powerful countries throughout time, one thing they had in common was a strong Navy. So throughout this era, the United States would begin to expand its Navy, and by the time it was over, it would have one of the most powerful navies in the world. Josiah Strong was a preacher that believed that the United States was superior again, and he wrote a book called Our Country, in which he said, Anglo-Saxons were superior, and it was the duty of the Anglo-Saxons and that of the United States to spread our ideals and values of Christianity and democracy to the rest of the world.
And try to understand the people of this land. This is our country.
Finally, there were some politicians that believed, that Teddy Roosevelt, who would eventually become president, he was governor. Henry Cabot Lodge and Albert Beveridge were both senators, and they believed that expansion and, when weaker nations fall to stronger nations, that's just part of the way of the world. It had always been that way. It was like survival of the fittest. Powerful nations take over weaker nations, and that's how things occur, and that's how things would continue to occur, and it justified the United States partaking in some of these actions.
Holding me back, 'cause I'm striving to be better yet.
The next thing I'd like to do in this lecture is move on and take a look at some of the territories the United States acquired during this era. First, which I don't have up here, was Alaska. The United States purchased Alaska in 1867 from Russia. At the time, it was thought to be a ridiculous purchase of land. They called it Seward's Folly, for he was the Secretary of State, had purchased this great big chunk of ice. No one had any idea at how valuable Alaska would become. Moving on from there, in 1889, the United States acquired American Samoa. They had been in conflict with Germany over this territory, and Germany and the United States ended up eventually splitting Samoa. Samoa is almost, it's very close off the coast of Asia. And there was a big push by European countries and the United States to get some access to Asia, especially China and Japan, because they had millions of consumers living there. Okay. Today, American Samoa is still a territory of the United States. Hawaii. Hawaii is an interesting story. Obviously, Hawaii is a state today, and how the United States acquired Hawaii was somewhat questionable. There's a lot of controversy how the United States acquired Hawaii. Hawaii had been run by a king or queen for many, many, many years. And at this time, Queen Liliuokalani was in control in Hawaii. And the first Americans that traveled to Hawaii went as missionaries. And they were there trying to convert the Hawaiians to Christianity, and they liked the climate, and so some continued to reside there. And they had children, and eventually the children became powerful planters. They were producing fruit and sugar, and they were exporting a lot of it to the United States. Well, eventually the United States sugar producers decided that this sugar coming in from Hawaii was detrimental to their market. And so the United States passed some tariffs against Hawaii, the Hawaiian sugar. Well, the planters in Hawaii, the American planters in Hawaii, were, this was devastating their crop and their economy, and so they decided to rise up and overthrow the Queen. This was not sponsored by the United States government. It was not, supported by the government or anything. And so they did, and they were led by Sanford Dole, and they overthrew the Queen, and they asked to become part of the United States. And at the time, Grover Cleveland was president. And so he sent some people over to investigate what had happened, and he refused to annex Hawaii. He said what had happened was unjust. They had no legal justification for overthrowing the Queen, and the United States would not annex Hawaii. Well, eventually, McKinley took over. Grover Cleveland was defeated. McKinley, a Republican president, saw the need for maybe some U.S. presence in the Pacific, saw it maybe as a strategical place for a naval base, and so McKinley ended up annexing Hawaii in 1898, and that is how the United States acquired Hawaii. Cuba is right off the coast of Florida, and Cuba had been controlled by Spain for hundreds of years, and they were rebelling against Spanish rule. And so they asked the United States, and the United States saw this as a good opportunity to maybe go to war with Spain, because Spain was not the power that it once had been, and for the first time stand up for the Monroe Doctrine, support the Monroe Doctrine. And so the United States in the 1890s entered into the Spanish-American War, and the following are some of the causes of this war. First of all, the Spanish were brutal in their treatment of Cuban rebels. They were trying to maintain control over Cuba, and some of the methods that they used were not very humane. Secondly, there was a big competition in America between some newspapers. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were using what was called yellow journalism, which was not completely outright lying, but kind of expanding the truth in order to increase circulation. And a lot of the articles that were coming out and the headlines that were coming out at this time were anti-Spain. And what it did was it whipped up Americans into an anti-Spanish frenzy. So the public was definitely pro-Cuba and pro-going to war to help the Cubans out during this time. Third, the Delome letter was a letter written by the Spanish Prime Minister ridiculing the United States and President McKinley, saying he didn't have any backbone and he was a weak president and so forth. This was intercepted and published in American newspapers. But really what tipped off the whole war was the United States sent a warship, the USS Maine, down to Cuba to evacuate American missionaries and American business people that were in Cuba at the time. And while it was in Havana Harbor, it exploded. And immediately the blame went to the Spanish, that the Spanish had blown up this American ship. Later to find out that it may possibly have been caused by an explosion, a fire in the boiler room. But that came out well after the Spanish had been blamed by all the newspapers and war had been declared. Here you can see some headlines for the day after. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, Spanish treachery, so forth. So there's some yellow journalism. So the Spanish-American War is the result, and this was a war that lasted only a few months. It was called the Splendid Little War. McKinley asked Congress to declare war in 1898. And on the heels of the Hawaiian debate, many in America questioned the reasoning behind going into Cuba and helping out the Cubans. Many believed it was just an attempt for the United States to acquire Cuba. And so to quiet the critics, the United States passed the Teller Amendment, like the Tell Her Amendment, that we are telling Cuba that when this is over, we are going to grant you your independence. You are going to be independent. So it was kind of a promise that when all was said and done, the United States would not acquire Cuba like it had Hawaii. Cuba would become free and independent. There weren't all that many famous battles that took place. It wasn't much of a war. But one battle I'm going to talk about for a minute because it led to the increased popularity of Teddy Roosevelt, which would lead him into becoming vice president and eventually president. The Battle of San Juan Hill, the United States was having some trouble taking this hill. And so Teddy Roosevelt, who'd been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, gathered up a group of people from various backgrounds. There were ex-convicts and cowboys and professional athletes, Native Americans, not anybody that had any real significant military background. And these people became known as the Rough Riders, and he led them up San Juan Hill. And as a result of this, he was kind of becoming a new national hero. The United States invaded Puerto Rico and kicked the Spanish out. And all told, in this conflict, the United States lost 3,200 men, but only 300 in combat. The rest were from diseases that were caught, malaria, yellow fever, from some of these warmer climates where they were fighting. At the end of this little war, the Treaty of Paris of 1898 was signed, and Cuba was freed from Spain. As a result of this treaty, the United States acquired Puerto Rico and Guam, which are still territories of the United States today. And the Philippines became a major issue. The United States said, well, the Spanish were in the Philippines. The Philippines were pretty close to Asia. This might be another important stepping stone toward Asia, so the United States decided to go to the Philippines and kick the Spanish out of there as well. And while they were fighting, they were helped by some Filipino guerrillas in their fighting against the Spanish. But afterward, there was going to be some debate on what would happen with the Philippines. And here you can see a map that shows where Guam and Puerto Rico are. Well, the United States decided that they were going to acquire the Philippines, and they paid $20 million, I think, for the Philippines. But the Filipinos, unlike the other countries that the United States had acquired, they didn't want anything to do with United States control. And so they led a rebellion against United States control, which lasted for many, many years. Emilio Aguinaldo was the leader, and in this rebellion, there were over 4,000 Americans killed, 16,000 Filipino rebels killed, and over 100,000 civilians killed. Eventually, after World War II, the Philippines were granted their independence by America.
Just leave me alone.
And here you can see how far the Philippines are from the United States and how strategically that island was toward gaining access to Asia. The Platt Amendment was, kind of followed the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment was before the war. So the Platt Amendment is what the United States signed with Cuba afterwards. And the United States didn't grant Cuba its complete independence. The United States reserved the right to use force to keep European powers out of Cuba. They reserved the right, they had to agree to any treaties that Cuba signed. They didn't want Cuba getting involved with any European countries. And maybe most importantly, the United States was given access to build a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, which obviously the United States still has today, because that is where many terrorists are being held.
So let me go, let me go.
Moving on to other territories the United States acquired. For a long time, it had been discussed among some of the world powers that it would be more efficient to build a canal across the tip of South America, so ships would not have to travel all the way around the tip. Colombia was a country, Panama had not even come into being yet, and Colombia refused to allow this to happen. And so the United States supported a revolution in Colombia in which Panama was established. Panama broke away from Colombia, and as a result of that, the United States gained control of this zone going through Panama to build this canal. It took 11 years to build. The United States built it and controlled it until 1996 when it was given back to Panama. And that concludes Unit 1 or Unit 5, Lecture 1. Next time we'll take a look at those that were against imperialism, because there was a movement in the United States that believed that this was hypocritical of the United States to look at, establishing empires when the United States itself was once an empire and eventually rebelled against Great Britain.